Voy a presentar la sesión y los ponentes en español y la sesión tendrá lugar en inglés, por si alguien no tiene y necesita traducción. Hay auriculares en el hall. Nos complace presentar esta sesión de literatura de viajes. Pallavi Aiyar, Javier Moro y Tharik Hussain en conversación con Guillermo Rodríguez. La literatura de viajes es una de las más antiguas. Ofrece una valiosa perspectiva social, cultural y política. Puede transmitir viajes personales y de crecimiento, las intrincadas historias de lugares y pueblos e incluso el poder y los límites de la mente. Pallavi Aiyar, Javier Moro y Tharik Hussain hablan de su trabajo, sus inspiraciones y del género elegido con Guillermo Rodríguez. Javier Moro, aclamado y leído escritor español, es autor de 12 libros. Saltó a los titulares cuando publicó El Sari Rojo, un libro que creó una enorme polémica en la India. Pasión India, la historia de la bailaora flamenca española que se casó con el Maharaja de Kapurthala en 1906. Ha sido un gran éxito con más de 1,3 millones de ejemplares vendidos. Invito a Javier Moro a subir al escenario. La galardonada periodista y columnista Pallavi Aiyar ha trabajado como corresponsal en el extranjero durante más de 2 décadas, informando desde China, Europa, Indonesia y Japón. Es autora de varios libros, entre ellos China, Memoir y Smoke and Mirrors, las novelas Chinese Whiskers y Jakarta Tales y New Old World, una exploración de los retos de la Europa contemporánea. Su último libro es Orienting, an Indian in Japan. Invito a Pallavi. Would you like to join us? Tharik Hussain es un autor especializado en el patrimonio y la cultura musulmanes que ha recibido el premio JLF del Gremio Británico y de Escritores de Viajes por su libro Minarets in the Mountains, A Journey into Muslim Europe, que también fue preseleccionado para el premio Edward Stanford Travel Book of the Year de 2022 y para el premio Baillie Gifford de no ficción de 2021. Fue nombrado Libro del Año por el Times Literary Supplement. Tharik ha producido programas de radio premiados para la BBC y ha publicado en The Guardian, Al Jazeera, la BBC, National Geographic Traveler y The Sunday Telegraph. Invito a Tharik Hussain a subir al escenario. Guillermo Rodríguez es el director fundador de la Casa de la India, un centro cultural pionero en España que se ha convertido en el modelo de la diplomacia cultural de la India en el extranjero. Experto en las relaciones indo-españolas, es académico multidisciplinar, traductor, gestor cultural y productor. Y ha publicado en la India, España, el Reino Unido, Francia, Polonia y Alemania sobre literatura india contemporánea, estética india y literatura bhakti. Es autor de When Mirrors Are Windows, A View of A.K. Ramanujan's Poetics y coeditor de Journeys, A Poet's Diary. Guillermo. Le paso la palabra a Guillermo.
Muchas gracias, Amina. Sí, muchas gracias, Amina. Bueno, vamos a hacer esta sesión en español, aunque a lo mejor es posible que a veces pregunte a Javier en español o en inglés, si os parece bien. Esta es la sesión más difícil. This is the most difficult session, and today for two reasons. I'm being ironic, okay? It's the 5:30 siesta session, but today also we're competing against siesta, and we are competing against Kabir Bedi Sandokan, who's signing books at the moment. So I hope we get a bit more audience towards the end, but the feeling, the vibe is there because it's the last session. And I shouldn't be sitting here actually, because this was to be moderated by Sheila Cremaschi. So the irony of the session that while it's called the travel session, the moderator could not travel from Hay, from the UK, because there's a strike, there's a transport strike. Okay. As we were preparing for the session, I would request first our international visitors, our writers Pallavi and Tharik, since you're more familiar with Javier, we will go through a brief introduction because audiences have been in the last few days telling me, but we want to know more about them, not so much necessarily about the book. The book we can read, but we can meet the authors here. They want to know about Pallavi. Who's Pallavi? What's behind the book or your stories? What's behind Tharik? So if you can tell us in your own words, rather than reading a CV. Yeah, we can start this way, yeah. Tell us, what you do, why you're involved in travel writing or whatever you do, and what moves you as a writer, as a person.
Thank you, Guillermo. And thank you all for being here, given the competition that we have. So I'm Tharik Hussain, and I'm of British Bangladeshi origin. I was actually born in Bangladesh in the northeast. I'm an immigrant in many ways, and I guess from the very beginning, travel has been an essential part of my identity, whether I chose that or not. So I've always been a little bit consumed with travel. And growing up far away from the place of birth, in a country where my identity, my sense of belonging was always in question, I guess my travel has been dramatically influenced by my desire to unravel that. But also being a Muslim, after a period of time, it was quite apparent that my religion was also a big focus for many people, including myself. So a lot of my travel, whether it's as a guidebook writer, I write a lot of guides for Lonely Planet. I've written the guide to, one of the only guides to Saudi Arabia for Lonely Planet, Bahrain, the south of Thailand, as well as obviously the narrative book that you mentioned. A lot of it is informed by my desire to try and, what I feel, is redress the way in which many marginalized communities are represented in the travel literary form. You see, for me, I think often travel literature is assumed to be this inoffensive, nice kind of form of literature that nobody really takes too seriously. And yet the reality is, throughout history, what we now call travel literature has shaped how we see other cultures. And when there's an imbalance in who is doing the travel writing, I think we end up with a very skewed perception. And that's part of the reason why the writing that I do tries to redress that. And we can go into that a bit more later. But certainly I try to do what many in the English-speaking world called to try and decolonize the literary form. And that's essentially where my writing comes from.
Okay, we come back to those very interesting issues. You talk about decolonization, deconstruction, and also self-exploration, self-search coming together, which is relatively common in UK or British scenarios. And very interesting to know more about that. Pallavi, please tell us about yourself.
So, I'm not sure, yeah. So I'm not sure that I would describe myself as a sort of conventional travel writer. What I have done is I have written biographies of the countries that I have lived in a kind of mezcla, a mixture with an element of autobiography or memoir. So I tend to tell the stories of me and my family moving to the different countries that we've lived in. We've lived there for a period of between 3 and 7 years, depending on the countries. And then I kind of gather those experiences that have emerged from my being a foreign correspondent, a reporter, a journalist reporting on that country, usually specifically for an Indian audience. And I have used that material to do a biography of that country. But all of this, was not something that I set out to do. And it was really a matter of an accident, or you might call it serendipity, or if you were Chinese, you would call it yuanfen, which loosely translates as fate or karma. And that has a Spanish connection to it. It all began when I was at university in London, which for an Indian of my background was quite usual. We were sort of very Anglophone and would often go to the UK to study further. But while I was doing my master's degree, I met a young, dashing Spanish fellow called Julio, who's not present here today, but who is now my husband. And we started to date. And what was hilarious was that I asked my then boyfriend Julio, darling, should I learn Spanish, since we're dating now? And he turned around and said, what nonsense, you should learn Chinese. That's the language of the future. And in fact, I did end up learning Chinese. We moved to China and lived there for the next 7 years. For a very long time, I resisted writing a travel book or any kind of book because I felt that to be a genuine travel writer, one had to have a project like following in the footsteps of somebody. You had to find a great historical figure and then follow in their footsteps, whereas that was not something I had done. But I realized that just by virtue of being an Indian in a country like China in the early part of the 21st century, I was in a very unique place to tell a very unique story. The world was learning about China. It was sort of exploding in the headlines. But as Tharik said, who was telling these stories and what were you learning about? And Guillermo, let me beg your patience. I will tell one anecdote before giving the stage to Javier. I'm aware that I shouldn't take up too much time. But just to give you an example of why I think it was important, my being an Indian in China, observing China, versus being a Westerner in China, observing China. I was a foreign correspondent. I was the only Indian foreign correspondent based in Beijing at the time, and there were something like 90 American journalists that were based in Beijing at the time, say in the run-up to the Olympic Games. And I would sit with my colleagues and we would look at the traffic in Beijing. And if you were a German, if you were an American, the usual rant would be about how terrible the traffic in Beijing was. And people would say, oh my God, these Chinese don't know how to drive, they're kind of zigzagging, they don't follow any rules. And then an Indian visitor would visit me in Beijing, and the first thing they would say was, oh my God, the Chinese are so orderly, they drive so well, there's no honking, there's no cows in the streets. So you were seeing exactly the same phenomenon, the traffic in Beijing. But the interpretation of that traffic in Beijing was diametrically opposite. And most of the world was hearing about the China with the terrible traffic. Not many people were hearing about the China with the very orderly traffic. So you see, it makes a difference who's writing the story. And for me, travel writing and writing about other countries has always been not just about those countries, but also about myself, learning more about myself, becoming more aware about the lenses through which I view the world, and therefore also developing a sensitivity to other people's lenses. I leave it there.
Thank you, Pallavi.
I'm a big fan of Pallavi, I must say, and I recommend reading her work because she writes as she is, burbujeante. She's like a copa de champán. And when you read her stuff, it's the same thing, the same quality. Very vibrant and very amusing and very good observer. And I'm looking forward to her book on her Spanish experience, but that's going to be more difficult because her husband is here. I mean, she has roots here. That's going to be,
tricky one.
that's going to be, but that's going to be the real book that we have to read about Pallavi. I just want to say a few words about travel writing. I'm not a travel writer, but I'm a travel writer reader. Sorry. I love reading travel books. And I was a big fan of Paul Theroux when Paul Theroux wrote those fantastic books. In concrete, one book on India that I absolutely adored, The Great Railway Bazaar. So I use that example to show you what travel writing is about. Travel writing is about a concrete moment. It's a snapshot of a place in a very concrete moment that will never be again the same again ever. The Great Railway Bazaar, it's the India of the 80s. And now that country doesn't exist anymore. You can read it now almost as a history book. How was India in that time? But no more as a travel book. It won't help you as a travel book. But still, the value of the book is the personality of the writer, because it still makes you laugh of those encounters in that fabulous train journey around it. But travel writing, it's as you said, it was the way we learn otherness. We learn about other cultures. We learn about other words. I mean, there have been travel writers since the beginning of history. And the great travel writers have given you that snapshot of that unique moment. Now you go back to India and you do the same railway bazaar trip that Paul Theroux did in the 80s, the book is going to be totally different. Even if written by the same author, totally different. So it has that value, travel writing. Now, among travel writing, there is also a distinction. There are travel writers that destacan, ¿cómo se dice that? Stand out because the personality of the writer comes across. And those are the books that they become classics. Viaje a Tartaria, there's some fantastic travel books that have become classic because what has survived is the personality of the author and his eye, the way he observes things, the way he sees things. After all, it's reality through the personality of the viewer, of the observer, and that is what remains, after all, of travel writing.
We wanted to come to the genre of travel writing and to the travel writer. That's our next round of questions, but you've actually skipped the first question. You've not allowed me to ask you the first question, and I'm going to do that in Spanish. Queremos saber algo de ti que no nos has contado. Nos gustaría saber, nos dices que no eres un escritor de viajes, pero tus libros implican un viaje porque hablas de otras culturas, una investigación, etc. ¿Por qué o cómo, o si fue accidental, tal, te metiste un poco en este género, en este mundo, ¿no? ¿Qué te motivó a escribir desde el principio? Porque ya el público te puede conocer por las grandes novelas las obras basadas en personajes históricos, etc. Pero ¿cómo entraste en este mundo?
Hombre, yo siempre he tenido la suerte de tener un padre que nos quería mucho, a mi hermano y a mí, y que nos quería que compartiésemos las ventajas que él podía. Él era un ejecutivo de una compañía aérea y viajaba gratis, y viajábamos gratis. Y entonces, por el mismo precio de unas vacaciones en Torremolinos en los años 60, nos pegábamos unos viajazos a Hong Kong, Tailandia, en un momento en que nadie viajaba. Entonces yo descubrí el mundo de pequeño con los viajes de mi padre y se me quedó ese virus dentro, ¿no? Para mí, irme a Asia era lo máximo. Era esos olores. Y además, a veces en Hong Kong yo recuerdo a mi padre que le daban arcadas por el olor del pescado seco, que es terrible, ¿no? Pero era la aventura, la gran aventura. Y bueno, claro, luego vino que el viaje se ha popularizado. La novedad geográfica ya casi no existe. Pero aún así me sigue gustando viajar. Aunque todo el mundo se parezca. Acabo de estar en Kazajstán. Bueno, pues es como si hubiera estado en Marte. Porque esa ciudad en medio de una estepa, 50 grados bajo cero, todo moderno, cargadores de Tesla. Y dices, ¿dónde estás? Me parecía una ciudad espacial. Sin embargo, todo ya te recuerda a tu mundo, ya no sales de tu mundo. Yo recuerdo el aeropuerto de Bangkok, había gente tirada en el suelo, trabajadores, no había luz casi, muy poco iluminado. Llegabas a la ciudad de Bangkok de noche, cruzando esos canales, y te parecía, era el misterio puro. Hoy en día da igual estar en el aeropuerto de Madrid que en el de Bangkok. Es decir, estás en el mismo mundo, ¿no? Pero aún así, la literatura de viajes sí sirve, por ejemplo, para retratar el momento en el que está. Porque es verdad, ¿cómo vive la modernidad el tipo de Kazajstán? Pues a mí me interesa saberlo. ¿Cómo vive la modernidad el chino? ¿Cómo viven en India la modernidad? ¿Cómo Japón vive esta decadencia tan grande desde los años 80? Ya casi no hay, ya no estamos rodeados de marcas japonesas. Ahora son coreanas, pero ¿ellos dónde están? ¿Cómo? O sea, eso sigue siendo muy interesante. Pero es verdad que ya la diferencia geográfica, el exotismo, entre comillas, prácticamente ha desaparecido.
Javier, you mentioned, interestingly, you mentioned traveling is like a virus, like a drug. Traveling is adventure. But we all like to travel, no? I mean, who does not like to travel? We all like to travel, and traveling is relatively easy now. And earlier this morning, we had a session on poetry where we talked about the travel, the imagination, the travel through the imagination. And it was Carlos Saura who said that, there's nothing quicker and faster. Even supersonic airplanes are not as fast as the imagination. The fastest travel in the world is the imagination. In travel writing, because we can travel for several reasons. We can travel because we travel for business, we travel as a tourist, we travel because we're journalists, or we travel for fun. There are two elements. One is you travel through your writing, but you're actually traveling to a different culture. So if I read your book, I may or may not go there, but it's a fascinating genre because, as you just said, you learn about the history, you may or may not go. And you create these characters. So for you, the genre of travel writing, did it come in connection with journalism? Did it come in connection with what is a travel writer for you? And do you think that you can be a specialist in this, or is it you're first a writer and then a travel writer? Is it something you can learn as a genre, or what moves you to write about traveling? Is it that kind of thing? There are certain people, and I know a lot of journalists who've done that later. And traveling can also be dangerous, and we suffer or we love it when it becomes tricky. And travel can also be funny, as you just said. So a little bit of that, please.
So the kind of travel writing that you're talking about, in the UK we call it armchair travel. Essentially, you sit in your armchair and you read, hopefully, my book, and then off you go. And what Javier has been alluding to is these books, they show us these amazing places, these exotic places, and I know that was problematic, but often they are exotic for us. But we're actually not just getting a snapshot of a place, we're getting that place through that person's eyes. And so you can have two very similar people at the same place, doing the same journey, and yet it provides a completely different experience, which is why a lot of these books are so popular for armchair travelers. Because in reality, they're not even going to, in my case, my most recent book is about the Western Balkans. You're not actually going to the Western Balkans, you're actually going to Tharik Hussain's Western Balkans. And this is something we forget. And that's where the joy comes in, because so much of the personality of the individual has to be there. And in my particular book, this is why Pallavi was looking at me when she said this, I actually follow in the footsteps of another travel writer because of the joy that I took in that. And this is the 17th century traveler, Evliya Çelebi, the Ottoman traveler. And by carrying him with me, I also get to use his lens and show what this place was like when he was wandering through it. And that comparison, that kind of travel of the imagination, for me, is what really makes travel literature such a powerful genre.
So is there, we talked also about ethics and aesthetics earlier throughout the day. Now, in your travel writing, which has this other component, which is, if you want, didactic, you want to reassess certain ways we look at, the particular countries, or ethnic or religious groups. Is there the ethical baggage, is it not too heavy saying I have to really take a different stance, I have to look at it differently? Do you have a particular reader in mind, or what moves you
Well, I keep the popular reader in mind because I want to make sure that I'm pitching it towards the mainstream author. But I used the term earlier to decolonize. And immediately when people hear that term, they immediately jump on the idea of colonialism. But what we're talking about here really, when we try to do this as writers, is to decolonize the space. Because the space of travel literature in the English-speaking world and in the Western world for far too long has been effectively dominated by a very narrow demographic. You may have heard in most of our explanations, when we're referring about travel writers, we talk about men. And this is who traditionally dominated the travel writing literature form. And they tended to be from privileged backgrounds, and they tended to be middle class and white. And so, as I said before, if we assume that travel literature is this nicey, inoffensive thing, then we can sometimes read what these men have written as being somehow objective, as a kind of objective take on China, as an objective take on Japan. And they have it developed into almost authorities on that. And that, for me, is where it can be a bit problematic, and that's why we need to diversify it.
Yeah. But it's actually very complex, because what we call Orientalism, to exoticize a particular other country, I often tend to, I tell my Indian friends, you have been Orientalized, but so has Spain. You're the British.
Occidentalism.
Yes.
Well, el exotismo es lo cotidiano de los demás.
Yes, whatever, anything that's otherness, and you know, the British travel writers coming to Spain and living in Mallorca or Granada or wherever, you know, and it's kind of, it goes full circle. So it's a very complex in many directions. What is your take on this?
Yeah, I'll come to my take on, I think absolutely Orientalism has been a major trope of all travel writing. What's pernicious about it is that people that are Orientalized tend to then self-Orientalize. They start to understand themselves through the lenses of those others who are sort of more powerful. But what I also wanted to say was that real travel literature, real reading of travel literature is, I think, the greatest antidote that there exists in the world today to this kind of ideological polarization, to this kind of building up of thought silos that we are seeing. Because to travel is to break down those barriers. To travel is to connect the dots. To travel is to begin to understand how fundamentally similar we all are. For example, no matter where in the world I've been, neighboring countries have been arguing about some kind of food. You know, if you go to Indonesia, it's fighting with Malaysia about who actually invented the lumpia, which is a kind of fried spring roll. If you go to Belgium, they're very upset that the French fries are called French fries when in fact frites were invented in Belgium. So whether we are talking about pakoras, samosas, mien, noodles, everybody has the same concerns and the same arguments. It's really quite funny. When I went to China, I thought this would be the most alien culture I can imagine from an Indian standpoint. In fact, I realized that the way that a Chinese person addresses a stranger is almost identical to how we do it in India. We say auntie, uncle, nana, nani, or grandmother, abuelo, abuela. We don't just say Mr. or Mrs. And that immediately created a resonance with this culture. So really, travel for me is softening those boundaries and discovering this kind of common humanity that we all have within us. And it's about learning about somewhere else, but equally, it's about learning about yourself. It's a traveling inwards as much as outwards.
It's about commonality, but sometimes what's interesting to see the differences and also what is lost in translation. So I will ask you, you don't have to reply now throughout the session, just think about the funniest or the most hilarious thing that has happened to you while traveling that you may have put in any of your books. You don't have to reply right now. The funniest thing that may have happened, okay? You don't have to reply right now. But I like the idea of also what is lost in translation and what is, you know, when you see different travelers, as what you said, different ways of looking at the same thing. And that's commonality, but at the same time, what enriches us is how we learn about ourselves, but how the own country may learn from the people that visit them, because you're looking at things differently. Javier?
No, why do people travel? There are several reasons why people travel. You can travel to forget about yourself. You can travel to get lost, to forget your life, to get a bubble of freedom out of your world. You can travel also for the opposite reason, to get a sense of belonging, to go for your roots, to go for what's missing in your life. You can travel as a tourist, which is you don't mix really with the people. You're just there watching a different scenario, a different scenery, but that's all. Or you can travel as a traveler and make that experience an experience that is life-changing to you. What I always said and I always found is when I'm never the same after a big travel than before I left. Something has changed every time I go. Every time I'm saying I'm going to do a big travel, I'm going to go to India for a month or 2 months, or I'm going to go, I'm not the same person than the one I left. It leaves an imprint in yourself, in your personality. There is something that makes you change. And I always advise people when they're in crisis or where they're in problems, go. Take a travel, take a trip. It's therapeutic also.
Healing process. Yeah, please, Pallavi.
Yeah. Just in terms of the funny things and the lost in translation, the things that are most immediately, resonating in my head right now have to do with Spain and Spanish. And I've had some hilarious experiences because of my very bad Spanish, and sometimes because of Spanish people's different accent in English. There was the time, for example, where I had a Spanish friend come and tell me about his father. And he sounded very proud about his father, and he said, you know, my father, he went to jail. And I was like, oh, what do you say? Like, that's terrible. But he kept smiling and looking very excited until I discovered he meant Yale. He went to Yale College in America, not to jail, right? Then I had another experience when I had dermatitis. I had a problem of my skin. So I went to El Corte Inglés, I went to the farmacia, and I asked for something for my skin. And the woman looked at me and said, do you know hell? And I was like, oh my God, is she asking me if I'm religious? Should I kind of, suddenly bow down? Is she trying to make me Catholic? No, she was saying, do you know gel? She was trying to give me gel for my hand, not hell, which is the opposite of heaven. The other time was when I was speaking in Spanish and I was explaining to somebody about Mahatma Gandhi. And I wanted to tell them about how Mahatma Gandhi was a lawyer before he became a leader, a political leader. And instead of saying avocat, how do you say it in Spanish? Abogado, I said aguacate, okay? So I was basically saying, and so then Mahatma Gandhi was an aguacate, which means avocado. And they were like, So, you have these absolutely hilarious lost in translation episodes, but I also wanted to read out one very small paragraph about what you lose when you travel, if with your permission.
I don't think you have a choice, Guillermo.
Hang on, where has this gone now?
Yes.
You have your own story, your anecdote?
Yeah, I have a small anecdote. It won't probably be anywhere near as hilarious as what we've just heard. But it's, a big part of my travel writing is to explore different Muslim cultures. So I found myself in Albania on the Riviera near Vlore, and I was with a friend of mine who also I knew from the UK, and I'm sitting there and I'm lying on the sun lounger, just relaxing, and he says to me, do you want something to drink, as you do? And so I'm thinking, yeah, I'm in safe hands, off you go. Yeah, I said, yeah, just grab me something to drink. So he comes back, and I've got the sun in my eyes, and I can't really see, and he's handing me a bottle, and I just take it, and I'm like, wait, what? This is beer, What are you doing giving me beer? He went, what, you want something stronger? And I was like, no, I'm a Muslim. And he's like, yeah, so am I. I'm a Muslim too. And it was for me, it was the first time to really acknowledge the fact that actually there were a lot of Muslim cultures that I wasn't aware of. For them, it's perfectly permissible, and they're actually quite different to us. Yes.
I found my paragraph, yes?
Great.
About loss and travel. Not everything about travel is salubrious or enriching. There are humiliating experiences at immigration checkpoints. There are moments of great frustration when you cannot be understood and cannot understand. There are limits to everyone's ability to embrace cultural diversity. Even though there were occasions when I pretended to the contrary, I never developed a taste for sea slugs in the years that I lived in China. In Jakarta, I grew aggravated with my inability to find a hair salon that used warm water for shampoos. In Tibet, I ran out of inventive excuses to pass on the yak testicles. In Brussels, I was robbed at the airport, barely 10 minutes after landing. In Berlin, I lost my luggage. In Cambodia, I lost my temper. In London, I lost my heart. But I always gained more than I lost.
Great.
Bravo.
That needs an applause. I told you she's talented.
Javier, una anécdota tuya, por favor, en español.
No, I have a horrible story to tell. I mean, the first that comes to mind.
English or Spanish? Which way?
Whatever you, as you
How
wish.
does it work better?
As you wish, you want.
En español.
En español, no. Eso fue el peor viaje de mi vida. Era de Katmandú a Lhasa con un grupo de turistas, porque no podíamos ir solos, entonces había que ir en grupo. Y una señora suiza, y al llegar a 4.000 metros le empezó a entrar el mar de altura. Y entonces dijimos, bueno, vamos a bajarles, nos volvemos, le bajamos, que es la única solución. Y la señora que yo he pagado este viaje. Y entonces veíamos que se moría, pero que no quería bajar porque lo había pagado. Entonces era ya, esta es Suiza, dices, bueno, ya te dices, claro, es que el dinero es importante para esta gente, pero tanto, y fue un viaje que nos definió al grupo que viajaba con ellas más que todo el resto de lo que veíamos. Luego el viaje a Tíbet, una vez que la señora llegó, acabó en el hospital, en Shigatse, en la primera ciudad, y bueno, nosotros llegamos, el viaje luego fue maravilloso, pero que es esas cosas que pasan, y fue el último, yo creo que es el único viaje en grupo que he hecho. En mi vida.
So after that, no more group travel, just on your own. Yeah, group travel can be strenuous. When you do your I suppose your professionals in whatever capacity you've gone, it's either been a commission to travel, to write a book, or to and you encounter tourist groups, which is another typical joke on what different groups do, whether they are from China, in Spain, or from Japan, and so on.
It's a plague. It's a plague because I mean, I remember I visited the Angkor temples in Cambodia. In 1992, war was still raging around. You could hear the missiles and mortars. And I was alone. I took a bike and I spent 3 days there absolutely, I mean, mesmerized by all. It's the most beautiful place on earth. I mean, it's something fabulous. I went back with my kids to share that experience with them. 3 years ago, it was Disneyland. It was totally changed.
But don't we
Full
have
of Chinese tourists everywhere. You couldn't enter a temple without a swarm of tourists, we're like ants everywhere in the place. And there's no more charm. There's nothing there as an experience anymore. And I can tell you that, but in FSO, in Turkey, the same thing. If your visit coincides with the arrival of the cruise ship, you're dead, because there are 5,000 guys there.
But you said another key word, experience. It's interesting because the tour operators, who are very clever, now they don't sell you trips, they sell you experiences. So this is getting dodgy and dodgy. You can hire a package where you either climb the Everest or jump off a temple and the craziest things just to give you an experience.
Believe me, it's not the same to visit the Abu Simbel temples in Egypt all by yourself at 5 in the morning,
of course,
than 2 hours later with 500 Japanese guys there. I mean, it's not the same thing. One is an enriching experience where you get inspiration from the place, and the other one is worth nothing.
¿Está funcionando la traducción? Oh, now, okay. We were lost in translation for a few minutes. Yeah.
No, que decía que no es lo mismo ver un lugar o los templos egipcios a las 5 de la mañana solo en ese decorado fabuloso, donde se crea una especie de comunión con el lugar que estás visitando, que verlo a lo mejor 2 horas más tarde con 500 japoneses dentro, o da igual la nacionalidad. Es que la experiencia no tiene nada que ver la una con la otra. El turismo, en cierto sentido, en muchos lugares históricos, es un poco una plaga, porque es que a mí se me quita la ilusión de ir a los sitios y sé que voy a verlo con 400 personas, o lo que contaba antes de los templos de Angkor llenos de chinos. Es que no tiene gracia. Sobre todo cuando los he conocido en otro momento.
Javier, I agree with you, but there's also a little bit of this nostalgia, and I'm going to ask Pallavi. I mean, we cannot change times, and I'm also certainly, to some extent, somehow romantic and nostalgic, and I tend to say that we were the last generation of the analogic travelers. Because to some extent, my theory is that traveling as we knew it, it's over, it's finished. Because you never disconnect. And you see it when you travel with your children. You used to travel earlier. When we were children, you were bored. You get bored, so you have to look at what's outside on the street, even if you're in a car. But now you're someone never disconnected from where you are. It takes time. I say that soul takes 4 days to travel. You travel, but it takes always 4 days. Your soul reaches 4 days later. That's my theory. And as I said, there's this controversy of whether the real travel is, or you have to leave your phone at home, which is impossible nowadays. You have to disconnect, or you have to travel to a place where there's no, and they sell it now as an asset, as a bonus. Yeah, go there, because there's no internet. That's the kind of funny thing. Please, you wanted to say something first? Yeah.
My kids, they go, sorry, just 1 second. My kids, I take them to the most beautiful hotels, and the first question is, ¿hay Wi-Fi?
What's the Wi-Fi code?
And the second question is, ¿cuál es la contraseña? They can't care less about the rest, about the swimming pools, whatever it has. They can't care less. Sorry.
No, not at all. So first I want to say that I absolutely love Javier, and he's this great mentor to me. But now I am going to disagree with you, yes?
That's a good one.
I did not like, for example, your analogy of the Chinese swarming everywhere like ants, okay?
No, the expression.
They just happen to be very populous. You are harking back to a time when only the privileged Europeans could travel. And now that the rest of the world is also on the move, the rest of the world also has the capacity to travel, which was denied to countries like India, which was denied to countries like China, which was denied to many parts of the world, who are now also trying to essentially do what the Europeans were doing. They were doing grand tours in the 19th century and so on, when Indians did not have the wherewithal to do that. So I understand that the experience becomes spoiled because what we want is this beautiful solitary experience in Angkor Wat with the sun rising rather than millions of Asians running around the place. But who gets that privilege of being the solitary person? You know, you're kind of all harking back to when we are the last of the generation who enjoyed that. You were the last of the you were the last of the time when Europe was on top.
And just to temper that a little bit, really, it's also about the democratization of travel. Travel has become considerably cheaper. And as somebody who lives in the UK, trust me, I have the same issue with Brits abroad, especially in Spain.
Yeah, so what it takes me to the last point, which is we have to travel in a different way then, if we want a different experience.
Yeah, that's what
and I think there's a little bit of, maybe a little bit of snobbery there as well. Because when we travel, we're obviously, very experienced. We have the confidence to get off a plane with only a compass or something silly like that. And we feel comfortable, getting lost. Not everybody is like that, and some people need it. It's the security for them to go to somewhere as far away as Angkor Wat, and I had the same experience, by the way. Yeah. It was awful. For them to go there, this is the only way they can do it.
So I agree with you, Pallavi, but I would go one step further. For those of us who've been, in the Himalayas or in very fragile environments, I've been a trekking guide throughout the 90s. That's how I paid my studies. In the initial years, you would see swarms of, not to use the word swarms of,
people.
Are you calling them bees?
People.
Bees is more romantic. Of Western tourists invading with Coca-Cola bottles 5,000 meter high camps and villages, and not conscious at all about environment, about anything, and spoiling everything. Those same people and their travel agencies, now 20 years later, are trying to teach the Indian or Asians that this is not a good way. And, we've done that. It's our responsibility. We were the pioneers. It's our responsibility.
Showed the way.
Show the way. And it's not a question of because initially I was getting very angry at those new way, because I had seen it again. So it's about sustainability is something we need to educate first ourselves, our children, and it takes time. Even when I came to Spain in the 70s, I grew up in Germany. And Germany was clean and ordered already in the 70s. I came to Spain in the 70s, Valladolid, Madrid, and I thought, wow, they don't know how to manage their garbage. They eat their pipas and throw them on the street. Nobody finds them. And it's a dirty place. It's chaotic. And look how things have changed, So change is possible. It's our common joint responsibility, and we can't blame each other.
But also, over-tourism is a real issue. And then it's about the sustainability, and it's about managing it. And I think, the kind of entities and the institutes that are in charge of these spaces have to look at what they're prioritizing as well.
But look at the spectacle of the Everest. I mean, there's the commercialization of the experience. And in the Everest, the other day, there was a photograph that showed a line of guys,
it's a
all
traffic
nationalities,
jam on Everest.
Traffic jam in the Everest, all nationalities, they wanted to have their diploma that they had reached, they touched the Everest. And they're there with, oxygen in line, waiting for their turn.
But again, there's a lot of hypocrisy there because, those are the guys who can now get to the top. And I've been with a lot of expeditions and with some of the top really famous climbers, and I really don't see eye to eye with them because it's about self-aggrandizement. Like, I don't do it that way. I do it the dangerous way,
Conquest.
And the kids now, they travel not to learn anything. They travel to show that they've been there because they make pictures of themselves constantly and they put them on Instagram.
No, I mean, I 100% agree that there is a problem. There is over-tourism. We have a fragile environment and ecology, and tourism has a big impact on that. But like with all environmental issues, there is also the issue of democracy, egalitarianism, equality, and these are just complex issues. So I think that what we should be careful about is not to say that, too many people is very bad, and therefore we have to, for example, charge a lot so we only get the right kind of tourists, which is what a lot of people say, which is then essentially just making travel possible for very rich people and, cordoning off the rest of the world that also deserve travel experiences. And like I was saying, it's an antidote to political polarization. It's a way of learning about each other. And so it's important that many people can get access to these experiences. We don't have a solution right now for how we do that sensitively. That is the conundrum.
Yeah, it's a very nice and intellectual thought, of course. But didn't you tell me the other day that you went to Seville and it was so crowded? Was it you? It was so crowded that you couldn't visit the cathedral because there was such a big line. I mean, yes, okay, democratize, whatever you want, but the bottom line is that the experience of traveling has fundamentally changed or has to change if you want to have a real transformative experience.
Yeah, I think Javier is also alluding to the shift in maybe travel culture. The way in which we travel. This is what I think is upsetting our friend Javier the most here. And I agree with him as a travel writer, but I also, as a travel writer, feel like, and I know, Javier, you're not a travel writer necessarily, so you don't have to take responsibility for this, but one of the reasons so many people love to travel is because of what we write as well.
Fine. Good point. It's a nice way of wrapping certain things up, because if you allow me, I want to do now a bit of a meta session. And this being, in some way, the last session, because the next session is about a gentleman we all love and adore, Mr. Kabir Bedi. This festival that we're celebrating now in Valladolid, Jaipur Literature Festival, JLF Valladolid, and I hope Sanjay is listening to me, is advertised as a caravan of writers, musicians coming from Jaipur to Valladolid. And in a true sense it is, It's about bringing ideas and physically travel, because you have to travel and come here. And you're in the heart of Spain, and I mean, we mean what we say. It's about bridges, it's about rivers. Music is the river, the bridge is the words. Do you think, or what is the value-added element of bringing to book fairs like this, or festivals, or literature festivals, people who from other cultures, mix them together, combine them, and have face-to-face interaction? And what was a bit of your experience in the last few days? I know we have only 2 minutes because I don't want to eat into the Q&A.
I'll be very quick, and you know, I'm not just saying this because Sanjay is here, but I think JLF is definitely one of the most important because of the way in which, when we look at the literary world, the global south and the writers of the global south, they are so poorly represented in the global north that JLF is one of the ways in which we clearly have much better exposure for those writers. And I'm saying this as somebody who lives in the UK, but as a South Asian, I remember going to JLF only last year, and it was the first literary festival where I felt like I was in my own community.
Hello, for you, the first JLF in Spain, you've been to so many JLFs around the world.
But this is very special because, you know, I might be a daughter of India, but I'm a daughter-in-law of Spain. And so for me to have JLF in Spain is something that is very, very special. I didn't imagine it even a year ago because JLF has been so Anglo-oriented and Anglo-focused. So to have it finally trying to kind of break out of that silo, that is real travel. When JLF travels to England and it travels to Australia and it travels to Canada and Belfast, I mean, that's travel of a certain kind, but real travel is when you break down those silos and go boldly where you haven't gone before.
Because that's what it is. Real travel is to move outside your comfort zone. Yes. And it's a challenge. And you're certainly afraid, and you may or may not want to take the next step, but one thing is for sure, you enrich yourself and you enrich the other.
It is an exhilarating experience. It is exhilarating, it is hilarious, things are lost, things are found, things are confused, but in the end, there is love in the air, true love.
And we have to bring in our audiences. So I would like to open the floor now. Vamos a abrir el turno para algunas preguntas, comentarios. Por favor, breve, si es posible, en un micrófono. Can we have a mic?
Where's my
Yes.
translator? I can't hear.
Okay, you can use mine.
Oh.
Is there any issue with the translation? Are you okay, guys? And a big round of applause to the translators back there. They've been doing a wonderful job. Amazing. Without them, no bridges. Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias. Ahí están los puentes. Yes, please.
Hola, buenas tardes. Una pregunta para Pallavi, porque estaba antes hojeando su página web y leí algo así como que las familias españolas, hablando de las diferencias culturales, graciosas, no graciosas, hablabas de las familias españolas e indias, que tenemos como un punto en común. Me gustaría que lo comentaras sin cortarte.
For me, Spain is the India of Europe. You know, really, I find that both Spanish people and Indians, you know, we are unguarded physically. We are always hugging. We are kind of touching each other, you know. During COVID, it was very interesting because I moved from Japan, which is a culture where there's no touching and there's physical distance, and you move to Spain. And it was so funny because people had to do social distancing and wear the masks. But I would see Spanish people, they wanted to do the beso. They wanted to do it. They wanted to do it. And they were holding themselves back, you know. And that reminded me of India, where we have this expansive, warm, very physical culture. We are both very loud countries. We talk loudly. We are very expressive. Javier has been very upset because we are staying in a hotel, which is on the road, and every day there is many people who are like talking loudly till late at night, and Javier says he can't sleep.
In a Delhi
But
street.
it's like being in Delhi. And again, when you come from somewhere like Japan, where you know people are always policing how loudly you are speaking. It's very important to be quiet. You know, I feel like I'm at home in Spain. What can I say? And the relationship with family, the strong
we
familial
kill bulls
bonds.
instead of caring for cows, but it's
And one sneaky, one thing that very few people here know, I'm not sure Guillermo knows also, is that Javier is actually family, because he's my husband's cousin, a distant cousin, but is a primo. So just like in India, you find always somebody that you meet is related to somebody's uncle, aunt,
Somebody's
and
a primo,
you
always
find
a primo
some
of somebody.
relation. Somebody is the primo somehow. Here also, I find I'm sitting next to my primo in-law.
60 seconds left, so if anyone has a 15-second question, una pregunta más, podemos coger solo si hay una.
Carlos.
Si me permites, la joven, sí. ¿Sí? Ya, ok, por favor. Mira qué amable, muchas gracias.
¿En inglés o en español?
En español, así te...
Español.
Sí.
Yo quisiera preguntar, ¿cómo ven ustedes que ha impactado la era digital a todo lo que es la literatura del turismo? ¿Cómo ha impactado? ¿Si ha impactado positiva o negativamente?
Bueno, a ver, está impactando ahora con el chat GTP en el sentido en que hay gente que escribe libros ya con la aplicación esta, pero vamos, yo no creo que eso vaya a ser algo duradero. Lo que ha impactado la era digital es la manera en que se viaja. O sea, mi hijo está en Estados Unidos, inmediatamente le veo en la pantalla. El problema no es que te llame, es que te llaman demasiado, porque claro, está constantemente, lo tienes ahí en tiempo real, cuando quiere, y encima con una calidad estupenda. Ya no sabes cómo escaparte. Entonces, en esto sí ha cambiado. Viajar no es lo que era porque, como tú decías muy bien antes, ya nunca desconectas. Es imposible. De hecho, hay sitios que los venden muy caros donde te aseguran la desconexión. Sitios sin wifi en sitios maravillosos. Hay una agencia que se ocupa de esto, que es de lujo, y donde estás garantizado durante 2 días de desconexión absoluta. Pero es un lujo hoy, la desconexión. Es un lujo.
Si dicen eso hace 20 años, te dirían que estás loco. Si te hubieran dicho eso, ¿no?
Sí, no, claro. Es que vas a ver tigres a la India, y te llama el fontanero de Madrid y tienes que atenderle. Es que es así.
Bueno, pues muchísimas gracias a Javier Moro, Pallavi Aiyar, Tharik Hussain, al festival.
Reitero las gracias a Pallavi Aiyar, Javier Moro, Tharik Hussain y Guillermo Rodríguez por participar en esta sesión. También agradecemos al Ayuntamiento de Valladolid y la Feria del Libro de Valladolid, la Junta de Castilla y León y nuestros anfitriones, el Círculo de Recreo. Queremos ofrecer una muestra de agradecimiento a nuestros ponentes por participar en este evento hoy. Pallavi y Javier firmarán sus libros en la Plaza de Mayor a las 6:45 hoy. También les invitamos más tarde a un concierto en la Plaza de Portugalete a las 9 a cargo de Usha Utap, una cantante legendaria. Y antes de eso, la siguiente sesión es Historias que debo contar, The Life of an Actor, con Kabir Bedi, Sandokan, a las 6:45.